The first speaker I would like to introduce is Max Gabriel, who will be giving our opening keynote. Max is a leading technologist in the information industry. He is the Chief Data Officer at Taylor & Francis and a Managing Partner at Informa Ventures.
Thank you, sir. Good morning. Welcome to day 2. When I was asked to talk about AI, blockchain, and data science and the impact it has, I just sort of reflected on it. Of course, AI and blockchain didn't just show up at our doorstep. There's been an evolution of technology over the past few decades to get to this point where we are. And today, I'm just going to explore the journey with you. I have less answers, more questions, so I'm as much an audience here than a speaker. I learned a lot through yesterday, listening to Andrew and others in terms of the real impact of what AI can actually do. So please participate and answer some of my questions, and it's more about us wondering out loud together. Before I start, a disclaimer. Is it just me? Is it ironic that the whole technology evolution can be summed up by humans verifying to a bot that telling them we're not a robot? And that's the evolution. And I can't wait to have the voice activation design that Alice was talking about for us to watch people screaming into the laptop saying, I'm not a robot. So you could imagine, that kind of is a culmination of where technology has come in. So before I take on, I just want to start with a small story. About a month ago, I caught up with a friend of mine who is a blockchain expert, and I met with him at a coffee shop in London, looking to learn something about what this blockchain is all about. So we met in this coffee shop. We had a cappuccino on the table. I was about to take a sip, and Tim said, do you know where this coffee comes from? I didn't realize it was a deeper question. I said, well, from the barista right across. And he said, no, do you really know where it comes from? And obviously, he knew a little more about coffee than I am because he'd been researching. So he started telling me this whole story about where it starts. It starts on a coffee farm, going through many, many hands of coffee farmers all around. He started scribbling in terms of the whole value chain of what happens before the coffee beans taking thousands, if not hundreds of miles of journey before it ends up into a barista and then ends up as a cup of coffee. By now, I've completely forgotten the question about the blockchain. It made me really wonder the ordinary things we do day to day, how interdependent and how interconnected they are. And I started admiring the elegance of interdependence, which is actually forgotten. Maybe Peter Senge, he was right. He said, the more interdependent we are, the least aware we are about it. So every little thing we do, there are thousands and thousands of steps that has to happen right for us to do that ordinary thing. And we've sort of lost sight of it. What does that have to do with the speech today? Stick with me. I'll somehow pull it together. So, as I was saying, we are more interdependent than ever before, but we're least aware of it. Let's come back to where we are today. Just a quick snapshot, 2018. Some undisputable facts about more than 7 billion people in the world. About 30 billion devices, according to Cisco, 30 billion connected devices in the world. If you take the mobile devices and everything else that can transmit data, it's roughly about 30 billion devices. And our retail commerce around the world is about $22 to $25 trillion. Up until recently, there wasn't a direct correlation to it. More people doesn't necessarily mean more devices doesn't necessarily mean more commerce. But increasingly, there's a direct correlation to these things. As you start to get more devices, your commerce is actually propelling at a different scale than what we're used to. For us to understand where we are, I just want to go through the evolution a little bit. So I've skipped the agriculture age. There are multiple versions of this, but let's actually walk through this. Industrial age, which you're all familiar with. People made a lot of money by owning big industries. Then the power and the money shifted to people who made big machines, whether mobile or immobile devices, cars, transports, computers. The power shifted to them. And then, over the past few decades, the power shifted to people that own data, information. Most of the time, that doesn't necessarily belong to them. And they made a lot of money. And that's the stage we live in. So I just want to explore, how did we get to this information age? Let's just walk through the history real quick. And I see there are 4 critical actors in this information age, starting with devices, which is the hardware we use to interact, the network that connects the devices or people, application, system, software, whatever you want to call it, a system that actually makes these things work, and then the data that goes in and out of your system. It all started with roughly about 1960 to 70 with mainframes, as you know. And these 4 actors were vertically integrated, as you know. Your device, data, application, network, they were all vertically integrated. They were one big thing that literally stayed in a room. That's what computing was. And they didn't really have direct influence on commerce. They had indirect influence in terms of how commerce was working. I actually thought they built a room with these people. Every mainframes picture I see, I saw the same 2 guys standing there. But it was entirely human-powered machines. That's how it started. And actually, even at that time, 1960s and 70s, when you look at it, computing was really helping the previous age of industrial age. They were actually supporting them. Then, somewhere at the end of 70s, the unbundling started to happen. If you remember the Netscape co-founder who said there's only 2 ways to make money in this world, which is you bundle things together, you make money, and then you unbundle them, you make money, right? And that's really what started to happen, end of 1970. The computing, as we knew it, started getting unbundled piece by piece. A lot of people made money, starting with devices, of course. There were more devices. The PCs and laptops started to flourish. And actually, the hardware manufacturers, there are a lot of leaders that came out of the business. They started making money. There were few networking companies, Cisco, Siemens. They were really powerful. They started establishing their monopoly at that time. But the networking was reasonably decentralized and distributed. The application, if you remember, it was client and server. So where a server was trying to control how the clients operated. Data was still in a controllable state. It was structured. It was proprietary. But now these systems were starting to slowly directly influence how commerce happened in a business. So at this time, this was 1980s to 90s, or late 90s. This was the phase where the power started shifting away from the networks to the hardware players. By end of that period, you could actually see more power shifting to people that were making softwares, companies like Oracle, Microsoft. They started becoming leaders, and the economics started flowing away from the hardware players over to the software companies. Companies were able to operate within themselves. The interoperability between industries and companies wasn't quite there, quite where it needed to be. Then came more realignment, end of 90s, as you know. Your network, which was decentralized and distributed, the World Wide Web, which is the internet, which became this one common network that anybody could connect to. And the devices didn't disappear. More devices. Mobile phone, as you remember, you saw the evolution of really dumb feature phones to incredibly smartphones. So they went through a big evolution of more and more devices starting to come in, and everything hanging to a single common open network. So there's no money in the network anymore. There's no money in the hardware, except 1 or 2 that still continue to make money. There wasn't much money in the software, but there are some players that are making money. Where's all the money coming from? the data, right? And you can actually see the power shifting in that direction. Just when the companies have realized, I've figured out the structured data, I'm going to handle the unstructured data, now you got a new problem, right? Big data. We got a big data problem that we need to sort out. And what's interesting about it is, and maybe it's obvious to you, it wasn't obvious to me until I started sitting and thinking it through or tracing it back. Well, these innovations here have been reasonably independent of each other, and they actually feed into each other in terms of the collective effort. The reason we ended up with big data is because of all those inventions that's been happening all around. Just a quick snapshot of the past 60 years. We had about less than 1 million devices about 60 years ago to 50 billion devices in 2020. And you can actually see the intelligence moving away from big central systems to all the smart devices, where the devices are going to be incredibly smarter than they've ever been. One of the side effects, or actually benefit, depending on how you want to look at it, is the amount of information and the data that's being produced. Up until 1900, the information doubled every century. By 1950, which was right before the information age started, the information doubled every 25 years. The phase we are in, as daunting as it sounds, it's doubling every year. The amount of information that's being produced is doubling every year. By 2020, it's going to double up twice a day. So we didn't arrive at the big data problem, we created it. The more devices we have, the more devices we create to this big cloud on the internet, you're producing more and more data. The point I made earlier about the reason this is daunting is because the individual industries continue to innovate independently and little out of sync with each other. So it constantly puts the business like us constantly trying to catch up. Just when we think we have sorted the structured data, you have the unstructured data problem. Just when you caught up with that, I said, I'm done with my mobile and internet strategy. Guess what? Well, what's going to happen with AI? What's going to happen to blockchain, right? Because these inventions and innovations are happening in out of sync, because we lost sight of the interdependence between them. And that's really the point I want to make. There's a lot of great news. The information age has given, for multiple industries, huge amount of benefits. We have more choices of service, whether it's food or transport or clothing, or the movies you want to watch, or the song you want to listen to. I didn't realize there were so many genres until I saw Netflix. I only thought it was boring and not boring, but there's so many genres that have been created because people want more choices, more than enough choices that have been created because of the information age. Access to much more information than any human can possibly consume. A lot of upside to it, because for the first time in the world, there are people that have the same access to information than they did a decade ago. That's the upside of it. But there's obviously deluge of information that's coming at you. I actually feel like if you put your head down, the stream coming at you, and when you put your head up, it stops for a second. There's a deluge of information that's actually coming at you. And what is really critical about this visual is if you picture that big mainframes that were stuck in a room, that device, innocent-looking device sitting in your hand, is more powerful than that big room, and it gives you access to much more information and computing power than we've ever had in the history. So that's the upside, one way to look at it. The commerce on how we transact today, how we buy stuff. What used to take months, it's taking weeks. What used to take weeks, it's taking days. What used to take days, it's taking hours. The commerce cycle is getting compressed and compressed and compressed. I don't know who mentioned this yesterday. The expectation from the consumers is only increasing in terms of being faster and cheaper, which has certainly propelled the world of commerce in terms of how quickly things need to happen, which is a big benefit out of the information age. One relevant area where most of us operate in, there's been more research published than ever before. There's been more research articles and intellectual property that's been created than ever before. And you can actually appreciate this virtuous cycle of more research, more inventions, more devices, more data. It's a virtuous cycle that keeps going. At the end of it all, the information age has built many new industries. The way we used to make money and profit have shifted along the chain, but our overall GDP, when you look at it, it's the highest than it has ever been. So it's all upside, right? The information age has given us benefit over the past 20 days. Not so fast. However, in the past 10 years, the overachievement of these few players and the scale and the pace with which they overachieved has created this widening gap of whether you are an end consumer or your business trying to figure out how do you make sense out of it, your unpreparedness is widening increasingly. And it's actually, the more they overachieve, the less prepared we are as business, as an individual consumer. That is the side effect of where it has happened. In the spirit of agility for us to move fast and break things, and you know who said it, we did break few things. We broke few things that were valuable to us. And I was actually encouraged by the conversation yesterday and the panel discussion that's going to follow today, something really, really valuable to all of us, the trust. The trust between the producer and the consumer, the supplier and the customer, is broken. There's a declining trust in the system in general. Is it ironic the information age, the biggest gift of the information is misinformation, which is getting curated, editorialized, and we live in this time and phase of huge amount of misinformation. And these parallel truths, I learned about 2 years ago, there are facts and alternative facts. If you're a researcher, good luck with that on how you're going to figure out the facts and alternate facts. There are parallel truths that we live in, and these things are not happening in isolation. They're all interdependent. They're all interrelated. The parallel truths is why there's a big negotiation going on now. The parallel truth is where some of the largest democracies are getting undermined. Some of the fundamental values are being questioned. And connected back to the puzzle, the network, the device, and the data, and this innocent-looking device can be incredibly powerful on one end, but it's also powerful in terms of producing these side effects. Privacy. When I got those nice-looking personal recommendations on Amazon, I didn't think I was paying a cost. I didn't think I was paying a price of my privacy. I don't remember checking a box and saying, I don't care about my privacy. There's nothing wrong with it. But you should be aware of what you're signing up for. And a lot of millennials, they absolutely don't mind because they're aware. It's transparent for them, but not for us. So I didn't know an innocent search that I was doing, someone else was making money on top of that. So why should personalization happen at the expense of privacy? Monopolies are not new, but the information age certainly has created some really large, unbeatable monopolies in the past decade or so. And it's nothing new. But actually, when you look at them between China and US, these 8 companies, they call the BAT in China, which is Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, and the FANG, as they call it in the US. Between these 8 companies, there's about a couple of $1 trillion worth of revenue and market capital, which is a significant portion of the overall revenue, right? So monopolies are not new. They've always been there. But the scale and the staggering speed at which this is growing is quite interesting, which is my point about companies that have realized the value and the power of data, especially when it's not their data, they're doing really well. So how did we get here? How did we get here? This is the time you actually answer the question, how did we get here? What happened? Every medicine, every medication we look at, it actually puts out the side effects, the benefits of the medication along with these are the side effects. I don't remember seeing the side effects of the benefits I was getting. These are my hypotheses. Is it because of the distance we created between the science and the humanities in our education system? Is it? I don't know. We actually divide the path of the children and say, you go down the science path, don't worry about the humanities. I don't know of a single coding school out there that actually talk about the implications and the impact of the code that they write. I went to a computer science, nobody talked about privacy. Nobody talked about the unintended consequences of the science. And why is that it's okay for the humanities students going on a path not to worry about the impact of technology on their discipline? I don't know. I'm just wondering. Is it because we create the divide early enough that there are more and more technology and science invention happening without thinking about the impact and the price we pay on the humanities? Is it because of the separation we build between the intelligence and empathy? Clearly, in the schools and the colleges, we value intelligence, we grade them, we rank them, we rate them, we celebrate them. But I would love for my 10-year-old to be rated and graded on empathy. If you don't do it at the school, we expect them, the moment they step into the enterprise, we want them to be empathetic to the customers all of a sudden. We want them to be empathetic to their colleagues. How? If you're not educated into that. I'm not saying that's the only reason, but clearly has to play into this. Is it the unintended consequences of what we have built actually starting to outweigh the intended consequences of our inventions? So it's not doom and gloom. It's actually, when you start to connect the dots, it starts to make sense. Is our education system and how our enterprise operate and behave and the environment, are they in sync? Or are we more out of sync in this information age than we've ever before? Are they feeding into each other? Are they benefiting from each other? Are they at odds with each other? Andrew mentioned yesterday in his speech about the reason for education to have interdisciplines, the mix of art and science that need to happen. Are we in sync in here? It's especially important as we stand here at the end of the information age, as we lean into the next phase. It's not late. We can do something about it. We can be conscious about it, not in a general across industry way, but within your business. What could we do? What do we need to be aware of? The question we ask, what can AI do for my business? What do I do with blockchain? Maybe we do need to ask additional questions along with that. So if we look at where we are, the intelligence age, the same four actors show up again: the device, the network, application, and data, but this time with more aggression, with more ambition, with more vigor. Devices, if you're at 30 billion, they're saying in the next 2 years it's going to hit 50 billion. It's only going to increase at a rapid pace. There are going to be more connected devices than, well, we already are, more humans in the world. With the IoT, you're going to have devices all over capturing and sending information back and forth. Do we need to think about other things along that? The good news is there are a lot of interesting startups. They're not necessarily looking at solving current problems. They're actually reaching back into, there's a startup in Germany working on, how do you say, the beehives. And they're using IoT to figure out how can they help. And there's a startup that's working on how do you help the rainforest. And they're not non-commercial entities, but if you're conscious about how can you use this invention and innovation to the benefit not only of your business, but the environment. Blockchain, I'm not going to go into too much depth, but basically this opens up what internet was supposed to be. It builds a transparency that we haven't had, and we should make use of the opportunity to create distributed networks. And one of the core part of blockchain is this distributed ledger system, which is essentially everyone having a copy of the same information, which, if you go back to, avoids the situation of parallel truth, because through blockchain, you will have an immutable version of the truth, and everyone will have a copy of it. And so there are opportunities where the technology, where it stands, there are opportunities for us to look at it and capitalize the right way, only if you're conscious about it. If you look at them, if you continue to look at them in isolation about big data, AI, blockchain independently, I'm afraid 20 years later we'll be sitting here, hopefully not, 20 years later we'll be looking at and asking the same question. A lot of interesting startups already coming out of blockchain. E-residency is out of Estonia. They want to create, the government of Estonia want to create great transparency for all their citizens, so they're actually putting all the documentation on blockchain. Humanic is a startup which is offering financial banking service for the unbankables, as they call it, people with no credit history or no credentials, who have no access to the traditional banking. Humanic is a startup that's actually working through to enable them and bring them into the commerce world. Alice is a startup which is actually trying to help trace out how a charity donation makes its way from the donor all the way to where it was supposed to go. So the good news is there are a lot of interesting, innovative ideas that's headed in the path. But the key is the interdependence. Andrew covered this a lot yesterday, so I'm not going to go too much detail into it. If you remember the 1960s and 70s, the giant mainframes that were controlled by those two guys, which is entirely controlled by human, it shifted to human-assisted and human aid to nearly autonomous. They are self-propelled by algorithms and the data we train them on. So that's the capability we're sitting on. So it's actually all the more reason we need to pay attention for what we are training them with, as Andrew was talking yesterday. This is an obvious point. Not only, we're maximizing how data comes into the business. I saw great examples on how we are repackaging products, how we are inventing business models through the use of data. So your device, network, your application, and data, they are far more powerful and at your disposal if you choose to use them at your disposal and not let them drive your business where you are on the receiving end of it. So the combination of these things are absolutely going to revolutionize the commerce as we know it. If you're at $22 trillion right now, this is only going to grow at a different scale, and the profit pools are going to shift along the journey. It's not going to be the same people that's going to continue to make money. But maybe we do have to work out some more details as we move into the intelligence age. Maybe we do have to pay attention, along with those four big actors. We probably need to add few more actors, few more additions into this operating system of intelligence age. The topic that came up yesterday, right? How do we make sure trust is not an afterthought? It's actually thought through ahead of time. How do we make sure privacy is taken seriously? How do we make sure we appreciate the interdependence, the primary and the secondary consequences of what we do? And how do we generate transparency into the product and services you're building? And I was quite encouraged by some of the examples that was demonstrated here. It's not that anyone is out there saying trust is not important, privacy is not important, but I'm also not hearing people are explicitly saying privacy is important, trust is important, transparency is important. So if you don't build that ahead of time, we may find ourselves as a recipient of the side effects rather than the benefits. So the question is, how do we make sure algorithms are unbiased? If they're trained by the data that we feed them, they're going to act accordingly. But if you unbias the algorithms, maybe when they do act autonomously, there's a lot more responsible autonomy than where we are. Privacy and personalization can coexist. It cannot be at the expense of one or the other. So what does that mean? As you're building your products, as you're defining your value proposition, take privacy seriously, because as an end consumer, it is important to you. And let's not, come at the end of it. If the information age has produced misinformation, the intelligence age, let's make sure it is trusted intelligence. And I know some of the peers here, this is our business. This is what we do. Let's make sure trust is codified along with the products we generate. If there's one point I want you to take away from here, it is an interdependent ecosystem. Every piece of the puzzle that matters. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time. And the technologies that we have here actually allows you to flatten the ecosystem where we could have open market infrastructure. Some of those blockchain startups that I showed you, that's what they're doing. They're creating open market infrastructure. So the tallest guy and the dwarf can get in the same place. The most profitable and the least profitable can enter into the same place. So there is an opportunity to have open market infrastructure where companies can participate. This is going to happen, right? There would be a continuous disintermediation. There will be redundant intermediaries that will get eliminated, but there's always place in the value chain for people to add value. But the good news is this will absolutely drive transparency into the system than ever before. So while we look at what what these technologies can do for us, we do need to think about how do we restore trust, privacy, transparency, and actually truly appreciate the interdependency. So this is my hypothesis. In order to do that, we do need interdisciplinary education, not only at the early days in school, but actually, whatever training and learning you're going through, start asking the question of what is the consequence, what is the impact of this new technology that I'm applying. So while you look at the benefits, look at the side effects as well proactively. We do need enterprises to be ethical, and I'm not in any way suggesting we're not, but actually, when you bring these additional technology inventions on top of what you already do, it's easier to lose sight of it if you're not explicit about what is the ethical driver behind doing this. And as I said, if they are in sync, they should drive a sustainable environment. Sustainable environment should be an end result of an ethical enterprise, not an isolated CSR program that companies do. And they do need to be in sync from education to enterprise to the environment. With that, look, I hope the picture really was we benefited a lot in the information age. There are huge benefits. We're also seeing some great side effects of that. But as we move into this, it's actually useful to appreciate the whole purpose of evolution is really to empower what we do, not get exploited. Thank you. There's actually a blockchain startup working on trying to figure out the source of my coffee. It's called Bex 360. There are two of them. Good. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Max. I'm sure we have some questions. So what questions do we have for Max? Fantastic presentation. Thank you. Yeah. We'll start here.
Thanks very much. Michelle Rennie, Computer Law. So I suppose I'm the only one that can admit to seeing the computer room with the big mainframes in it. And having worked through from that era to where we are now is what I do in terms of law. Again, trust, privacy, all these things come to the fore, having spent the whole of May drafting 20 variations of GDPR for clients. trying to protect their IPR against exploitation by other parties, going down the data chain of the cloud and the interception of monies that have been done in transit. So that's why I'm looking at the blockchain answer, and I think it's been absolutely excellent talk on where we've come from, and hopefully where we're going is to transform where we are into not exploiting, but empowering the next generation of people going forward and using what we've got for the better. So thank you.
Very well said. That was a better pitch than what I did. Thank you.
Hi, Jo Collins. I actually worked on the mainframes as well as one of the older people in the room. I thought it was a brilliant presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
The question which always goes through my mind, and particularly if you look back at 2008 and the crash, and you realise how complex things have become. So we talk about the need for transparency, but at the same time, what we also find is that things are becoming so complex that actually a smaller and smaller number of people really understand what's happening. So how do you actually combine those two things to make sure that we don't all get lost in a situation where we really don't know what's happening to us?
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. I think Andrew touched on it yesterday. One of the either impediments or the risk of artificial intelligence is the explainability of how you got there, right? Which is quite opposite of well-researched report that's that actually walks you through the path to an answer. With artificial, it's not hard, it's not impossible, but we've taken it for granted that AI is making this recommendation. None of us actually asked the question of how did you come up with that? What was the motive? What was the driver behind it? I don't have an answer for you, Joe, but all I can tell you is we just need to be a lot more aware of it. And ask the question about if there's a AI algorithm you're using on, how do you explain the answer? How do you arrive at that? And I agree, things are a lot more complicated than what it needs to be because the information distribution is controlled by very few players. That's the opportunity you have with blockchain, where there's an opportunity for everyone to have the same version of the information that you can work with. But it's individual businesses, doesn't matter what size you are, being aware of it, being conscious of it, not taking those 4 things for granted, and saying someone else in the value chain will worry about it is the key reason there.
Thanks, that was a great talk. I followed all of it up until the point that you said about disintermediated commerce. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, please? Thanks.
Sure. It is basically, what has happened historically is the middleman or middlewoman in a business has always been disintermediated. That is simply a value chain becoming more efficient. If you have redundant intermediaries in the business, with every stage of evolution, a middleman has been cut out of the equation, right? And you'll actually expect to see a lot more, which means the startup that I was talking about, they are trying to figure out how do you get the coffee bean from the farmers directly to the consumer rather than having the 20 middlemen in the middle, right? That's, it depends on which side of the coin you are. It's either an advantage if you're a consumer, but if you are one of the middlemen, it is a problem, right? And it is going to happen. And there's always places in the value chain for you to add value, and it's appreciating where as a business you can add value. Anyone that's redundant is going to get disintermediated. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for a great talk. In an age of fake news, how are we going to prevent blockchain immutably locking in all the falsehoods?
That's the million-dollar question, because there's an assumption around the intent of someone making that first entry that it is right? But if that's not, then everybody has the copy of it. It does address the problem of parallel truths, right? So your bank doesn't have a ledger different from what you have. Now, everybody has the same ledger, but in terms of the intent behind the entry that's going in is an issue. It's exactly what I said, explainability of AI and the intent behind how you make that entry are issues that are not even discussed about, right? That are not even talked about. So it's easy to get enamored by the ultra-powerful capability of these technologies, but if you're not aware of these things, we'll be walking blind into the situation. When you find the answer, Dan, I would love to know.
Hi, it's Jay Wilson from Elsevier. I really liked your point about interdisciplinary education. I think because I actually benefited from that about 30 years ago at Sussex University, where the School of Cognitive Computing was actually a multidisciplinary school. And I think that has set me up very well for navigating where we are now. My question is, there's a dichotomy almost between the knowledge you get from being able to code and really dig into data, and for most people's experience of software and products, is user interface, because that frames your interaction and limits it in various ways. So I just wondered if you had thoughts about our kind of what we have to do as producers of products to try and bridge that gap between the understanding of coding and what we produce as user interfaces.
That separation, I loved your presentation yesterday, by the way. No, the separation is real, and I'm glad to hear there are some schools that are doing interdisciplinary, right, in terms of bringing the pieces together. But we do segment the roles, right? If you go back to what I said, someone is making a human check, I'm not a robot, clearly tells you they haven't thought about, you have a human on the other side, you're telling them you're not a robot and actually trying to conform to a bot, right? Somebody lost the plot there in terms of figuring out who's on the other side. That's exactly my point. 4 years of computer science degree, not once a customer or business or ethics was ever mentioned, right? I didn't go to the same school as you, but you could actually appreciate that the more and more engineers graduate that know how to code without thinking about the impact and implication to the environment, that's what we live with, right? That's the inefficiency we have lived with. I was talking to someone earlier, the definition and the distinction we've had between structured data and unstructured data, it's a self-imposed constraint. The software couldn't handle unstructured data, right? There was nothing complicated about it. The original software couldn't handle unstructured data, and all of a sudden we built this divide, and we sort of let the companies and industries suffer because of that. I don't have an answer to it, but when you're sending your colleagues out there for training, don't segment the roles and say that's a designer problem. An editor have to care as much as user interface as much as a designer, right? Because you would if you're sitting on the other side. And we've segmented that path, too early. And I wish, we can do something about in the school where they're clearly outdated on, what the enterprise needs. A great question.
Thank you. Just one observation. That thing about I'm not a robot is actually slightly even more unethical, because typically what you do, you click on an image and you're training a neural network, and they're not very explicit about that. No. So you're doing work for them. You're not just saying I'm human. You're actually
helping.
The robots are now making us do the work.
Yes. Clever.
Okay, time for one more question.
It's not really a question. Something happened to me while you were talking.
Uh-oh.
I was tweeting, I got locked out, and I just went through a 6-stage I am not a robot stat capture. Just thought you'd quite like to know that, the irony.
I had nothing to do with that, but...
Okay, we might have time for one last question.
Hi, I'm Freddie Quack. I like the theme that you say about this interdependent ecosystem. Do you think that in publishing we are working more together, or should we be doing more to work together and help each other?
Should we is an obvious question, right? an obvious answer to it.
But are we?
Are we is where, when you look at, if we embrace, let me go back to, when Linux as an operating system that came along, it was actually perceived as a threat to the proprietary software that existed. In fact, it actually built much, much larger industry for other software players than what would have been a closed system, right? So the upside is much, much greater for people to work on common infrastructure. And you compete on quality of service and product rather than the infrastructure. And unfortunately, I've been fortunate enough to work in multiple industries. I've never seen as many reinvention as I've seen in publishing industry.
Great note to finish on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.